All right, so this week we're going to be talking about the Affluent Society, which many call the golden age of America because no time before 1951 in human history was food so available and cheap. It's a time of economic expansion, stable prices, low unemployment, and rising standard of living. Um, and so it all starts with the standard of living in ordinary citizens. You have the diet, housing, income, education, recreation, and so on and so forth. All of these things are coming to hitting America, and almost all people lived better than their parents and their grandparents. You know, you have TV, air conditioning, automatic dishwashers, long distance telephones, jet air travel, things of that nature. So when you get all of those things, you get a changing economy. You also get people who start to move west with government contracts. They're going to cities like Seattle, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Phoenix, Denver, and the Rockies. And they start building for the Cold War guided missiles, airplanes, radar, things of that nature, shipyards, air military bases throughout the country. And this is really after World War I, the height of U.S. manufacturing. After the 1950s, it will slowly go down, steadily go down. But the idea is you just can't keep producing like you did during the war. Um, the South is industrializing as well. And they also shift from labor intensive cotton to growing things like soy and poultry and beef. So they're kind of, I don't know how else you could say it, but the South is diversifying as well. However, during the 1950s, more than 3 million people will migrate from the South to the North, to the West, or the Northwest. And so what they start creating is what we call the suburban nation. Um, the drive of the economy becomes building houses and consumer goods. And so there's a shift from the cities to the suburbs to create demand for all of these things. Um, in the 1950s alone, the number of houses in America doubled, and leave-it towns, which were pre-assembled houses, were going up everywhere. They're like from Sears, and they're priced well. So what they are is they're basically a home in a kit. You order your home, it comes to you in a kit, and then somebody puts it up, and bam, you have a house. It's cheap, it's easy, it's affordable, so on and so forth. And so what you get out of these suburbs that are growing outside of the cities is you get the mall. And you get a mall and where people go and they drive their cars there. Um, Malls are one-stop shopping, right? So and you don't want to go in all the way into town now to get everything you need. So people start building malls, and then you get strip malls and so on and so forth. And so this really transforms the daily life and habits of Americans. We start to commute longer distances. We go further on our vacations. And this really also alters the actual physical landscape of America because you get things like motels, fast food places, drive-ins. McDonald's is created in 1954, and in 10 years there's 700 McDonald's throughout the country, and they're selling over 400 million burgers. And so really what happens is the car symbolizes one of the identities of freedom. It's mobility and it's private choice, right? You can get in your car and choose where to go. And there's this idea of leaving the urban landscape for the open road. And so we we just discussed the West is growing. And California becomes the symbol of this post-war boom. And from 1950 to 1975, 30 million people move from east of the Mississippi to west of the Mississippi. This is a huge migration west. And so you start getting cities that are centerless, meaning they don't have a really important economic center They don't have a downtown. You get cities like Houston, Phoenix, Los Angeles, Denver. Um, if you've been to any of these places, which I'm sure you have, they differ from the East because in the East, cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and New York, Boston, et cetera, their downtown is the economic center and it's linked with public transportation, right? You'd take the subway into town, or you take the bus or the train, and so on and so forth. However, in the West, you get these clusters of single family homes that become united by highways, right? We call it urban sprawl, right? They're very spread out in the West. The cities, the cities are larger in the West geographically by square mileage than the East. Um, Also, during this time period, you get the TV world. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we talk about the TV world, one thing I wanted to mention about suburbs is it's kind of suburbs are another way to segregate, and people begin to move into suburbs where other people are like them. So, for instance, in 1990, nearly 90% of suburban whites lived in communities with non-white populations of less than 1%. So even though people are moving and America is changing drastically, some things aren't changing in the fact that people are moving to where other people are like them, which is only natural, I suppose. In a lot of ways, it's not good, but it is natural. So now we can talk about TV world. Advertising and the television become very important in American society. If anybody's ever watched the show Mad Men, you've seen it. By the end of the 1950s, 9 out of 10 families have a television. And not only does it become a common source for entertainment, but also news. And it also changes our eating habits, such as frozen dinners, eating in front of the TV instead of at the table type of idea. And with a few exceptions, and we'll talk more about it later, is that um, most TV shows stayed away from controversy, and they centered on the family. People like things like Leave It to Beaver. Um, you know, mom stays home and keeps the keeps everything together. Dad goes to work, comes home, he's tired, and then the two boys get in trouble, but then they go to school and then they come home, and then there's a moral of the story at the end of it. Everybody's happy. Mom and dad sleep in separate beds, so on and so forth. We'll talk more a little bit about television next week, but that's the basic idea. Um, Interestingly enough, for women, real quick, they're working more than ever. Um, but they're in the workforce more than ever. But the landscape has changed, and it becomes part time in a lot of areas, and it's to help their middle class lifestyle, not necessarily to have an independent career or pull their families out of poverty. Um, in 1960, women earned 60% of men, but even though this is occurring, a lot of things are still pointing to staying at home, um, and becoming a mother and a good mother and a good wife. If you're a woman, your average age of marriage was 22. Divorces go down, and children go up in the 1950s. And so, even at a time of low migration, as far as people from non-Americans migrating into America, it really slows down during this time period. The United States population went up 30 million. It shot up. And what also kind of what doesn't shoot up, what actually kind of goes down, is this idea of feminism. It kind of disappears for a while. Uh, Things kind of calm down, people become complacent, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Um, and so, what really happens is people begin connecting free enterprise with freedom. And so, when I'm talking about free enterprise, what we're talking about is an economic system of private ownerships that unites the West. The idea of a libertarian conservative has not come into our parlance yet, but we will see that the beginning of what the Conservative Party is today is the process starts now. The idea is freedom meant autonomy, limited government, unregulated business. And it's really popular in the growing West and the South. And people who desire to pursue their fortunes free from government regulations, free from high taxes, and they don't want to be in unions. They don't want to be forced to be in unions, right? Like we kind of talked about last week. So, and we'll talk more and then about the creator of what is modern republicanism in our next slide, and that happens to be the president after Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower. He emerges from World War II as the military leader of D-Day. He is a hero. And he really was worried that the Republican Party would go back to isolationism after the war, just like the most of the United States did after World War I. And he felt like the United States could not do that anymore, being the most powerful nation in the world. So he ran, and he actually got elected quite easily. And he had as his vice president a little fairly more well known, but still not completely well known, the senator from California, Richard Nixon. Um, Although President Nixon, and we'll talk more about him quite later as he becomes president, is known for dishonesty and opportunism, which he was all of those things. But we'll talk about a lot of the good that he did as well. Excuse me. He did change, him and I did change the Republican Party from being completely aligned with big business and seen that way to thinking about the quote unquote forgotten man. The forgotten man was the hardworking man burdened by taxes in an unresponsive large bureaucracy, right? So in 1952, now that we have TVs in a lot of homes, the presidency is real. This for the first time, people can kind of see what's happening in the presidency every day. And they talk about how the president is being sold like toothpaste, which is funny because a lot of the ad execs who worked on a toothpaste advertising scam, or not scam, scheme, also were involved in helping Eisenhower build his campaign for television, because obviously he's not used to television, so this is something that happens. And really, one of the main things that Eisenhower says when he gets elected, or to get elected, is he says, I'm going to go to the Korean War and I'm going to end the thing. And he actually does, and he wins 2 terms quite easily. But even though he's popular, the party is not as popular as him. And in 1956, he became the first president to win a presidential election without the majority in Congress. And he really does keep things and drama to a minimum, which is a good thing. And like we said, he is really the beginning of what we call modern republicanism today. Washington changes with his cabinet. It's the first time in 20 years there's a Republican president. And although he does not feel like big business can run roughshod over everybody, and that they need to pay people correctly for their work, etc., etc. He does have quite a few CEOs and other higher ups advising him for economic matters. And in fact, the CEO for GM, who is one of his advisors, comes up with the quote, what is good for the country is good for General Motors, and what is good for General Motors is good for the country, which in a lot of ways that's very true. He championed business, especially small business, but also fiscal conservatism. He scaled back government spending, he felt, even with the military. Excuse me. Um, so he scales back even the military, and he's the one who championed the phrase military-industrial complex, which we'll talk about briefly later. He cuts government spending even while he expanded many New Deal programs like Social Security. And what Eisenhower wants to do is to make sure that the Republicans move forward. And he also provides over the biggest public works project in U.S. history, which was the building of the 41,000-mile interstate system that we have today. Um, and the reason why he got it passed were for a couple reasons. Firstly, he could argue that it was for safety during the Cold War, so people could get out of large cities easily if they were to be bombed by the Russians. But also, it helped it helped build economic things for automobile work, manufacturers, home builders, construction unions, oil industry, all of these um, things in the American economy that drive it are being helped by this huge interstate project. And when the Russians put Sputnik in space, which was a satellite, which was a very big deal and very scary in 1957, Eisenhower, comes up with the National Defense Education Act, which was the first time the government helped with higher education. And what it was basically STEM, uh, science and technology and math, and making sure that the United States did not fall further behind the Soviet Union in things like math and science. Um, During this time period, we also get what is known as massive retaliation. He does end Korea with an armistice, but tensions are still high between the United States and the Soviet Union, and some of the highest during this 1952-53 um, time until JFK. What is also important is that in 1952, the United States gets the hydrogen bomb, which is more powerful than the atomic bomb. Um, but the Soviets do it the next year as well. So what happens is both sides feverishly begin to develop long-range bombers to transport these bombs. Um, and so Eisenhower says that even though we are fighting the Soviets and they're building up and we're building up, we still have to make sure that our whole economy is not pushed by what he calls the military industrial complex, right? That everybody just gets so fired up about the military that everything else gets the back seat. In one of his speeches, he says that, and I quote, "Every gun that is made, every warship that is launched, signifies theft from those who hunger and are not fed." Right? But at the same time, because of the time period, his Secretary of State, William Dulles, comes up with the acronym, because everybody loves acronyms, of MAD, which is Mutually Assured Destruction. And this is something that we follow throughout the war. And the basic idea is that um, we're going to build so much, and the Soviets are going to build so much, that if they launch a bomb, let's say at Seattle, because that would be probably their main target at first, we would be able to retaliate and bomb Moscow, right? So the idea was the Soviets knew that if they attacked us, it would be the end of them as well, hence the mutually assured destruction. And I'm sure if you ask your grandparents or even your parents, this is the time period when we start training our children during class with school drills on what to do if the Soviets attack. You know, people are building bomb shelters and so on and so forth. Because there was this thought in the early to mid 1950s that World War III was imminent. But now the United States is trying to figure out how can we get people to survive it, right? We'll build this big interstate system so they can move. We'll build bomb shelters. We'll tell children what to do, and so on and so forth. Um, and so all of these things are happening happening during Eisenhower's early run um, as president. And so what goes kind of hand in hand with what we've kind of been talking about is this idea of mass society. Um, as politically in the 1950s, as far as a lot of people are can talk about, is people start to tame down and look into the private sphere for freedom rather than the public. Meaning, people are, this isn't the New Deal anymore. People aren't looking to the government for the public works project and things like that. They start to look into private companies for this. Um, we start getting these ideas about corporate leaders and the politicians and military men. We call them the quote unquote power elite. People argue, some, not everybody, say these are the men who are keeping people happy and making democracy obsolete. And you start getting quote unquote organization men, um, who who people say are incapable of thought because modern work was so monotonous and people stopped thinking for themselves. But even at in this time period in the 1950s, very few social critics had much to say either. So when I'm talking about an organization man, I'm talking about a guy who wakes up, goes to work 9 to 5, comes home, has dinner served to him, reads the newspaper, watches TV, goes to sleep, repeat, 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 right? That's a way to make a living and to support your family, but a lot of people are saying, but at what cost? And so what you start to get is these baby boomers are coming of age. A lot of and especially at the end of the 1950s, are these kids who were born during and right after the war into the 1960s are coming of age. And so you start getting movies. I don't know if any of you have heard of them, but like Blackboard Jungle and Rebel Without a Cause. And these are movies of alienated youth. And they really spur the idea of juvenile delinquency. And here's a picture of one of probably the two most famous quote unquote poster kids of juvenile delinquency. This is James Dean with Marilyn Monroe, and then the other one would be Marlon Brando. Right, and so these people wear leather jackets and they ride motorcycles. They listen to rock and roll, and they basically do things, and then the movies are about how they're so much different from their parents and their parents can't understand them and they don't understand their parents, right? There's a very, maybe I can find it and put it on YouTube, a scene where James Dean is in jail and his parents come and they have this talk about how they can't communicate with each other, right? You get people also like Elvis Presley who become famous, who are bringing African American music and what black musicians had been doing for a long time into mainstream radio, and people are listening to him. And if you've seen that Forrest Gump, he's moving his hips, and the Beatles and Eric Clapton and Bob Dylan and Led Zeppelin, they're all bringing this old African American, the blues, and they're making it mainstream. And so people are listening to Little Richard songs that they've never heard before, just being sung by Elvis Presley. Um, and I know that my mother was not allowed to listen to the Beatles growing up. So I'm sure your parents and grandparents have uh, stories about that as well. During this time, we also get what are called the beatniks, and here are the two most famous ones, Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. And they start railing against mainstream culture. Uh, Ginsberg writes Howl, which is a kind of a stream of consciousness, kind of fairly hard to understand book slash prose against materialism and conformism, and perhaps why it's so hard to understand is because he's tripping on LSD. Um, uh, the same thing with Kerouac but on the road's a little easier to understand. His very famous and popular book On the Road. He also talks about materialism and suburbanites, and instead of doing 9 to 5, these guys celebrate impulsive action, immediate pleasure, with drugs and sexual experimentation. So it's kind of this idea that they're kind of pushing back against the 9 to 5 quote unquote organization men. So that's kind of what's happening in society. But perhaps most importantly is we start getting the inkling of the freedom movement. It won't be until the 1960s, which we'll talk about later, when things really start to hit the fan. But the civil rights movement really starts to gain steam in the 1950s. Um, and it came as a bit of surprise to a lot of people. And because the only place that the really one of the only places that it's really affecting anybody is kind of in the mid South and the South, especially with all, black churches. And it was a very nonviolent assault on separate but equal, or segregation. And what happens is in the 1950s, half of all African Americans still live in what the government calls poverty. And like I said, in the South, you still had signs of separate but equal everywhere. And we're talking about entrances to buildings, fountains, theaters, restaurants, any buses, any public thing, you still had the separation of blacks and whites. Even in the West and the North, it wasn't that great. So, for example, we already talked about Jackie Robinson, right? He lives in New York, and then they're going to move to Los Angeles in 1954. He has to ride in the back of the bus. He can't stay at the same hotels as his teammates. He can't eat at the same restaurant as his teammates. We had a lot of African American entertainers in Las Vegas, for example. Sammy Davis Jr., who will be part of the Rat Pack with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and those guys. Louis Armstrong, Lena Horne. These are all people who performed on the Strip, but they could not stay in the hotels where they were performing. And in a lot of cases, people just kind of sat back and watched. There wasn't a lot that people did, especially in the North, to end this type of behavior. So what happens first is that there's an illegal, because the government is not keen to help, and the federal government hasn't really been keen to help since Reconstruction, right? And the beginning of this class. Um, the freedom movement starts with um, legal action and legal assault. So it fell to the courts. And in lots of areas, the NAACP and groups like LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, really starts to grow and become this movement, and they move for equality through fighting against restrictive housing, asking for fair employment, and wanting to end segregation. And so the main push behind all this is the 1954 case Brown versus Board of Education. It starts with Thurgood Marshall, very famous lawyer, who is the head lawyer for the NAACP, and this is a frontal assault. What he wanted to do was support local cases of black parents challenging unfair school policies, in the sense that we have this separate but equal, but we have cases, thousands of cases of kids having to go further to school than they should because they live closer to an all-white school. Thousands of cases of African Americans going to schools with no running water or indoor toilets in 1950s America, right? And so what Thurgood Marshall does is he puts 5 cases together, and one of them gets to the Supreme Court. And Brown was alphabetically first, so him and his daughter's case goes to the Supreme Court in 1954. And what it was about was that his third grade daughter was forced to walk across dangerous railroad rather than being allowed to attend the white school that was right next to her house. Right? And this became Brown versus the Board of Education, and it attacks separate but equal. And even in 1954, when Eisenhower hears about it, he really wants this to go to the Supreme Court. He says, you have a real complaint, and we need to get this solved in the South. And many were on the side of Brown. So um, it goes to what we will call the Warren Court, which was headed by Earl Warren. And this is very interesting. It will be known for a very active agent for social change during this time period. But Earl Warren was the governor of California when they interned Japanese Americans during World War II, and he was for it. But then after the war, he has a huge change of heart and he becomes a human rights activist. And so in 1954, the Warren Court says that separate but equal as far as education is concerned, goes against the 14th Amendment. And in the field of education, it has no place, and we know for a fact that all schools are inherently unequal. And although it took some time, the Supreme Court in 1954 says all schools have to desegregate. And so what happens after this ruling is kind of a mass movement. And when I say mass action, I mean people start to Brown versus Board of Education really is an agent for social change, and it really starts in Montgomery, Alabama. This mass freedom movement. And it starts, and then the most famous after Brown versus Board of Education deals with Rosa Parks. So on the 1st of December 1955, Rosa Parks, who was a tailor's assistant, was done with her work for the day and refused to surrender her seat on the bus to a white rider. She was sitting in the front to middle, and somebody came in and said, "You need to move to the back." And that was local law. She said no. So the bus stopped and she was arrested, and her arrest sparks a year-long boycott and really begins a mass movement phase in the South. And today she's still known as the seamstress with tired feet, and she's really a very good symbol of ordinary people fighting Jim Crow. However, there's something we should know about her. She was a political activist. She could vote. She had worked for NAACP, and she was highly intelligent. So this means that she knew what she was doing. So I think which even makes it more important is the fact that this was planned, because they were tired of it, and so it was not something that was spontaneous, but rather it was planned. And so for 381 days, and despite legal harassment and occasional violence, black maids, janitors, students, anybody who used public transportation and paid for it, walked or took quote unquote informal taxis to work, people who would help them move from one place to the other. And this hurt the bus industry so much that in November of 1956, the Supreme Court also then desegregates public transportation, right? So the Brown Board versus Education desegregates education. Now they desegregate public transportation. And this makes world news, and it kind of makes the U.S. look bad. And so people are looking at the United States as this champion of freedom, and we're here still fighting to desegregate public transportation and education. In Montgomery, Alabama, and we'll talk a little bit more about him next week, especially him and Malcolm X, as you get a young 26-year-old minister who becomes this national symbol. And this is really when the idea of freedom comes into everyday vocabulary for the civil rights movement. And Martin Luther King Jr. talks about the daybreak of freedom and justice and equality. He wants people to address African Americans as Mr. or Mrs., just like they do to white Americans, right? That's a sign of respect. He wants votes. he wants schooling, he wants employment, and so on and so forth. And in 1963, we get the I Have a Dream speech that talks about how 100 years after the war, Negroes are still not free. And what Martin Luther King Jr. does very effectively through his charisma and his intelligence is that he merges the Black experience with the vocabulary of the nation. He outlines the philosophy of struggle, in which evil must be met with good, hate with Christian love, and violence with peaceful demands. He invokes the Bible to preach justice and forgiveness, even towards those who, quote unquote, desire to deprive you of your freedom. And this really hits home with a lot of white Americans throughout the country because he's saying we're protesting, but we love America and we're devoted to its national values. We just want freedom. Right. And so by 1956, he has the Southern Christian League with ministers and activists, white, black, from the North, from the South. And he's becoming this really popular person. Um, and what's interesting about this is they're also fighting against the South's refusal to follow Brown versus Board of Education. Um, So in response to this, in 1956, 82 of 106 Southern congressmen and every senator except for Lyndon Baines Johnson, who will be president one day, signed the Southern Manifesto. And the Southern Manifesto denounces Brown versus Board of Education as a clear abuse of judicial power, and it called for the resistance to forced integration by any means necessary. And so what happened? So basically, they're saying white places for white people, black places for black people, and they should not mix. This is 82 of 106 Southern congressmen and all of their senators, except uh, the man who will become JFK's vice president. Right. And so what many southern states start doing is they start closing down schools and privately giving whites money to create private schools with government money, right? And some public schools in the South were closed for the next 5 years. Um, and really, during this time, Eisenhower and the federal government tries to stay out of it. They're saying this is kind of a states' rights. Although the Supreme Court said segregation is illegal, that's hard to enforce in every single school in the South. That would basically mean the South would have to, or the North would have to go in, the federal government go into the South and kind of force everybody to desegregate, which is impossible. But in a fairly isolated incident in 1957, at Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas, the governor, a man by the last name of Faubus, uses the National Guard to block the school. So what Eisenhower does is he sends in federal troops from the 101st Airborne Division to help escort 9 black children into the school. This is a somewhat isolated incident, but by 1957, Dwight Eisenhower has said, in some way, shape, or form, you need to start following the rules and using the National Guard to keep African Americans out of a desegregated school will not be tolerated by the federal government. Um, and so that's kind of where we'll end with the 1950s and this affluent society. Much like every week we discuss things, there's a lot of good that's happening in America. People are moving, people are migrating to new jobs, new places. We have more and better food, cars, houses than ever before in human history. I guess that would be because cars are relatively new in the whole scheme of human history. But we also have the bad. right? The South just refuses to desegregate, and it gets violent a lot of times. But we'll talk more about that in the 1960s. But the main point is that change is coming to America, whether the South wants it or not, and we will talk about that next week with the 1960s. So that's your PowerPoint presentation for the week. Please let me know if you have any questions throughout.